talk to a lot of mineral owners who are really bothered by and confused by the fact that their grandparents made so much more money on these royalties than they're making. And they don't quite understand why that is. So I want to go over some of the reasons that this happens because it's a very common question and something that a lot of people wonder. There are several reasons for this. So let's go over a couple of them. The first one is the history of farming. There used to be a lot more farmers, and the chances are your grandparents or your great-grandparents were farmers, and they probably had a good-sized tract of land. So if you have somebody who, say, owns 200 acres of land, there are a lot more opportunities for wells to be drilled, for them not to be dry holes, for them to be actual productive producing wells. And if you own the surface and the minerals, you own 100% of the minerals. So you're going to be receiving all of those royalties. That's very rare nowadays. There are not very many people who own 100% of the minerals. Almost all of us own an undivided fractionalized interest. And I'll explain what that is later. In fact, I have another video about that I'll link below. But what happens over time is that the minerals get fractioned and passed down from generation to generation. So let's say Grandpa has 100 acres in Texas, and he has 5 children. So he splits those 100 acres. Maybe he does something with the surface. He sells it and reserves the minerals. And then the minerals are passed down to 5 children. So now the original grandfather has 100 net mineral acres. And now each child has 20 net mineral acres. So we've gone from 1 mineral owner to 5 mineral owners, and they own each 1/5 of what Grandpa was making. So if you fast forward a little bit more, each of them are going to have a few children, and they're going to pass their 20% onto all of their children. And of course, a long time ago, people had many children. You know, my grandmother had 12, 3 sets of twins actually. And so the minerals get fractioned really quickly over time. And in just a couple of generations, you can go from someone owning 100% of the minerals to you've got like a great-grandchildren who maybe own like 1 net mineral acre. And you just don't make a lot of money on the royalties when it's fractioned to that degree. And unfortunately, as time goes on, the fractioning problem gets worse. And in states where you don't have a Dormant Mineral Act, then a lot of these tiny minerals, they just get lost. They're forgotten about. They're not worth filing probate and doing the legal process to transfer the ownership, and they just get left behind, and then eventually nobody knows who owns them. So let's talk about another reason that your royalty checks are probably significantly less than your grandparents'. The other thing that happens is that all oil fields eventually run dry. Oil and gas are finite resources. So as you extract them from the ground, you have less and less to extract. So there's actually a decline curve that you see with oil and gas wells. And with these new horizontal fracked wells, you very often see very, very steep declines. So the first maybe 2 years of production are going to be very, very high. The next couple of years will still be pretty high, but it will have declined significantly. Maybe between 40, you might be making maybe 40% or maybe 10% of what the well was producing in the beginning. So if you fast forward a couple of generations, many of those wells have been plugged, they've been abandoned, they're just no longer producing anything. And there may be other wells that have been drilled meanwhile, but those also will decline. So over time, the wells that were producing when your grandmother or your parents when they owned the minerals, the production is likely much less now. Of course, there's exceptions because, we had the fracking boom and the shale revolution, same thing. And so it revived these areas where we thought we had extracted all the oil and gas. So there's certainly exceptions, but generally speaking, fractionalization and the decline of production are the main reasons that you're not making as much on your royalty checks as your grandmother was. The other thing that could have some influence is the price of commodities. Oil and gas fluctuates. There was a time not too long ago where natural gas was $14 an MCF. And then there were years where it floated around $2 an MCF. And now we're temporarily back up a little bit to, around the $5 range at the moment. And that changes, and it has a huge impact on your royalties. Like if you just think about if you were being paid on gas at $2 an MCF and your grandmother or your mother was being paid on gas at $14 an MCF, and the well was much more productive and she owned more interest, it all adds up to a much, much bigger royalty check. So I think that's why people have the sense that they shouldn't sell their mineral rights, because they were so valuable when their parents or their grandparents or great-grandparents owned them. But they're not as valuable nowadays. And it's not to say that there isn't value. There's certainly a lot of value. There's a lot of mineral owners who have made out really well with the shale revolution, but it's just different today. And when you compare it with what your parents and grandparents are making, you just have to take into account that it was fractioned and that you own a lot less, that the wells are probably less productive, and the price of oil and gas can change. Also, the density of where the oil wells were, because when they first started drilling, they had oil wells in, right next to each other. And they found that they were not conserving the resource and producing the resource in a responsible way. And so they had to create spacing limits so that you couldn't necessarily just drain your neighbor's minerals. It's a whole complicated history, but it's fun to read about. So something interesting to look at if you're interested.